Good morning. Welcome to Member Focus Monday. I'm Christina Schaefer, Social Media Manager for HAR. We have a very special guest this morning, award-winning investigative reporter and author Bill Dedman. Bill, welcome.
Good morning, Christina, and hello, Houstonians.
Yes, we're so glad that you could join us this morning. We have a lot to share. You've shared some very special insider clips with us, which we're excited about as well. Before we get started, if you could just quickly introduce yourself to our members.
Well, hello. You know, I never turned down an opportunity to visit Houston in July. Always good.
It's the perfect climate for you right now, too, right?
Yes, I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm a longtime newspaper reporter. I've worked in TV and radio, wrote a nonfiction book, but spent the last few years at Newsday on Long Island. That's the newspaper for the suburban areas east of New York City.
Okay, very good. So we have a lot to share this morning. We're going to be talking about the Long Island Divided investigation. Some of you may have never heard of it. Some of you might be well aware of it. Before we get into it and start talking to Bill and actually see some video clips of some of the things that took place, go ahead and like this video, share it so that others can see it as well, because what we're sharing today and what we'll be discussing are some of the unconscious bias that occur. So even if you think, well, that won't happen here, that doesn't happen here, that's never happened to me, maybe some of the things you'll see today might change your mind. So go ahead and like this and give us a share. So Bill, you won a Pulitzer Prize for an investigation in mortgage lending practices. I thought it might be interesting before we get into the Long Island Divided documentary, if you could share with us a brief summary of that investigation as well, and just tell us how long you've been kind of involved with this and been involved with this topic specifically.
Sure. So this was in the late 1980s in Atlanta. The series of articles was called The Color of Money. And what we looked at was mortgage lending practices specifically by the banks. And it was about redlining. It was about lenders in Atlanta who were making loans even in lower income white neighborhoods, but did not make loans, did no business in the African American areas, even the higher income areas. And we also looked at the practices, just how things worked, where locations, bank locations were, where you could put in a mortgage application, the marketing to realtors in different parts of the city. And one thing that we saw in that was how small decisions by a company could have a very great effect. And later in Boston, I did something that touches on this similarly, which was called Speed Trap. You have to have a clever name for a series. And this was about differences in who gets a ticket and who gets a warning when you're pulled over for speeding. We all know everybody who gets pulled over for speeding was speeding. But some people get a break. And when we looked at warnings and tickets, we saw that you could predict who would get the break if you knew the age, sex, and race of the driver. Women got a break up until about age 40. It's very similar to who gets a drink bought for them at the bar. White men got much more of a break compared with African American and Latino men. And so you could lay it out from one category to another and predict what in fact did happen. I think that both of those were based on public records. We're always looking for the best information to get at what's happening. What's different about the Long Island Divided series is that it was done with video, with hidden cameras. And so here we can see what's happening. Yeah. And the other key thing that's different is that you're seeing the faces of the actors in this, the people who work for the real estate companies. And so in effect, names are being named. It's not about the banks or the police. This person from this real estate company and how they're working with individual clients. And so that made it feel very different. And as we all know, seeing it in the video makes what we think of as a systemic problem much more real to many readers and viewers.
So let's talk about that. The Newsday investigation is probably the most prominent example of the existence of of race-based bias in real estate. So why did you decide to start that investigation?
So this was done in Long Island, suburbs east of New York City, two very heavily populated counties reaching all the way out to the affluent Hamptons area. And one of the most segregated suburbs in America. Depending on how you count it, perhaps the most segregated, and partly where American suburbs started, where Levittown is, for example. And we had long heard anecdotal information from our own staff, people of color, you know, that tell the sort of stories where maybe a mixed race couple would say, oh, we had to hide my wife or hide my husband when we were shopping for a home until we showed up at the closing, and boy, were they surprised. Something was said to someone through the years. It was all very anecdotal, and we wanted to know, well, what's happening now? And the only way to get at that is to do testing, paired testing, where you send out two people with the same circumstances, the same criteria. What is different about them is their race, and then you see what happened. In effect, we were following the methods that fair housing groups use when they investigate following up on complaints. What was different in our method from what fair housing groups did is that we recorded video with hidden cameras. And so the men had cameras in their shirts, the women had cameras in their purses. It's legal to record conversations in most states if one party, in this case the tester, agrees to be recorded. That's legal in New York, and it's legal in Texas. So one thing that we can do, I think, to sort of give you a flavor of it is show you a part of the introduction. We produced a series of articles called Long Island Divided, and we produced a 40-minute documentary film. And we're just going to show you little clips from that film.
Yes.
This clip is about a case of barrier to entry where two home buyers with the same criteria were, one was helped and the other was not helped. We called that barrier to entry, or you could call it failure to serve. So maybe we can see that.
Absolutely. So we, like I said, Bill has several video clips that we're going to be taking a look at. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first one now, the barrier to entry.
We're not going to like those schools. But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional, how can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different areas?
I'm not going to send you anything you want to do, unless you don't want to store your car to buy your friend.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way.
Yeah, okay, I definitely need that.
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, you shouldn't pay the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination. You would never know unless you go undercover.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor. They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I asked. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, about getting pre-approved.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out anyone unless you have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to. So that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny May couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
Okay, so that's just the start, and we will share a link to the entire documentary if you'd like to see that, but we do have some more clips from it to share with you all as we go through. So again, thank you, Bill, for sharing that with us. So if we could just get into, they describe it a little bit in the video, but if we could get into a little bit of who was tested and what was the outcome. And I know it's a lot to share from a 40-minute documentary and a lot of articles, but just kind of a summary of who was tested and what was the outcome.
So we focused on home sales, not rentals. It's actually easier to test rentals. You send in one person, then another, and you see if they're true. We tested sales. We sent out first-time home buyers. So these were not people who needed to sell another home to buy. We'd send a white home buyer and then separately an Asian home buyer, an African American home buyer, or a Latino home buyer. And we would mix up the order of who went first. The testers gave the agents the same circumstances and their constraints on their home search. So the same script was followed. They're first-time home buyers. We sent out people of the same gender, roughly the same age, dressed in the same business casual clothes, same geographic area, say within 30 minutes of a particular community, or within a 45-minute commute to downtown. They had the same family size, they had the same stated price range, up to X number of dollars, the same number of bedrooms, same income if asked, same credit score if asked, and the same status as whether they were pre-approved or not for a mortgage. And we shot for houses from entry level. Some pairs were asking for, these are New York prices, about $400,000 in that suburb would be an entry home, up to about $7 million price range. But always the same number for both halves of the test. And we used the same agent. That wouldn't really be necessary in a fair housing lawsuit. An office of a real estate company is supposed to treat all of the customers the same, whether they are helped by the same agent or not. But we thought that it would be more persuasive to the readers and more fair if we had them see the same agent. And we let the companies choose the agents. The company would assign an agent to our first home buyer, and then we would approach that agent with the second home buyer. We did 86 matched pairs, 86 pairs. And some tests involved multiple agents, so there were 93 agents overall. They were at 12 companies or brands that together have more than half the market on Long Island. Those 12 brands have more than half the listings. And they included several of the big national names: Coldwell Banker, Century 21, Keller Williams, and Remax, and Realty Connect, some regional brands that Douglas Elliman, brands that had part of that were strong regionally. All of our testers were Long Islanders. Some of them came from church groups or from friends of friends, but most of them were actually actors, because actors are out of work and will do part-time work and can memorize a script. We trained them with their identities, their credit scores, how to answer questions in a neutral way. We dressed them roughly the same, and we rigged them up with the cameras. And then we reviewed their tests, watching the videos to make sure that they did what they were supposed to. The testers met with agents, they received listings, and they went on home tours. And then we reviewed our 240 hours of video. We then analyzed where the listings were, what the demographics were of the communities or school districts or census tracts where the homes were located. Then we gave these results for each test to two fair housing experts, one who had run testing for the Department of Justice and one who's the law professor who wrote the book on fair housing. And we had them review sort of like referees, and only if both referees threw the flag did we count the test as out of bounds. Then we gave all the results to the agents themselves and to the brokerages so they could respond and see the maps of the listings, and we included all their responses in the articles. Then we put all the videos online.
Right.
And all the material online, so it was as transparent as could be. In other words, this was a careful effort that took more than 3 years. It was not a drive-by investigation.
Right. So we actually had a question, are these tests from the 80s? And I think that's what's so alarming about this is they're not.
No, these tests are from 2016, 17.
Yes, so this is
and
recent.
So now the
so
now the results.
Yes.
So the two agents the agents seeing the same two customers gave unequal treatment in 40% of our tests. But the results were not the same for each race or ethnicity of tester. 19% of the time they gave lesser service to the Asian American buyer than to the white buyer. 39% of the time, so about 4 out of 10, they gave less service to the Hispanic or Latino buyer than the white buyer. And 49% of the time, half the time, they gave less service to the African American or different service to the African American buyer than the white buyer. And most of the attention, understandably because of our history and current events, fell on those differences for the African American buyers, half of them with a difference. But let's not disregard the 4 out of 10 or even 2 out of 10. If 50 years after the passage of the civil rights laws, 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, 2 out of 10 Asian buyers encountered differences, that's a significant difference. We're not saying that these scientifically are what you would get if you did 10,000 tests, but we do think that they demonstrate that a buyer runs a risk, a significant risk of encountering different treatment in the market. I think one question for you is, does anyone doubt that we would get similar results if we did the same tests in Detroit or St. Louis or San Francisco or Houston or Atlanta? Most of the differences were issues of steering. Black buyers got fewer listings. They got fewer listings in wider areas. White buyers were directed toward wider areas. And then there were the refusals to serve. The most prevalent of those was this issue of pre-approval. Both buyers had no pre-approval, but the African American buyer would not be served at all, would get no listings. Or a black or Hispanic buyer might face an insistence that they sign an exclusive contract with the agent when the same agent would serve the white home buyer client or potential client without that. Then there were the issues of inappropriate comments, which wasn't the main thing we were testing for. We were testing for steering, but it was unmistakable that agents said things which create Fair Housing Act violations, and they said those to the white buyers. The minority buyers didn't get any comments about race. We're well past the days when you have a sign up that says, we don't serve your kind, sort of thing.
Right. So
they got a shake.
Not to make those comments.
They got a smile and a handshake.
Yeah.
But there were inappropriate comments made repeatedly to the white half of the test, and we can watch some of those.
Yes, let's watch a quick video clip about that.
Hispanic community came in, and they really took over Springs and Northwest Woods area.
Here, an agent gives conflicting advice about Freeport.
I like Freeport. Now you have a bad school district, and that's not good for resale value.
call the school bus, see the moms that are hanging out on the corners.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood. It's mini United Nations.
Because you might be more comfortable in a certain demographic area that isn't heavily one way or another in terms of the people.
Bayshore has two school districts, Brentwood and Bayshore. You don't want to have Brentwood School District. You want to have Bayshore School District.
I can't say anything, but I encourage you. I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your wife to buy diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They didn't buy there.
No, that's great.
I have to say it without saying it. You know, you have the knowledge of the areas.
Yes.
You know. I don't want to use the word steer, but I try to. I'll use another word. I educate in the areas. You know.
Yeah. How are you, Russ? Hey, Russ. Good. How are you?
We're either waiting for the owner or waiting for the agent to show up.
You don't want to be. I don't think you should be in Elmont. I think you should probably just be Franklin Square.
And I remember specifically, he talked about steering.
Yes, that's what he said. Steering, yeah.
Yeah. And in the same breath, he mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
There's something called steering. No steering, you know, like steering.
Oh, like a car or something?
No, like a horse, you know.
Wow. And somebody said it in the comments too. Wow, just wow, right?
One thing I'd add about inappropriate comments is I think it's easy for us to focus on those and for that to be the carry away message. And I have an idea that that's a message that a lot of real estate agents have carried away from their training in fair housing through the year. Don't say the wrong thing. Most agents didn't say the wrong thing. But if that's the only message in training, it's not sufficient, because what we found was what they did caused a lot of steering, a lot of different treatment, a lot of unequal treatment. And our team attended fair housing trainings in New York State and found them very slim on content, and shared the transcripts with experts who said that this is shocking how little actual training on fair housing is happening in this fair housing class, which agents in that state are required to take. And now the courses have all been stopped, the curriculum's being rewritten, and we'll see if it improves. But I think it's easy, and you know, we've shown you here inappropriate comments. They get all the attention, but let's not let that be the only part of this that we pay attention to.
Right, exactly. So let's back up just a bit and have you answer the question, what is steering? Because we heard it in the video, you just said it now. So what is steering?
It's a good question. Like redlining, steering is a term that's a little loosely. It's not really the legal standard. It's a bit of jargon, a common word that we just use, has different meanings for different people. But in essence, it means, for example, telling one person that no apartment is available and then telling an equally qualified person that there are apartments, or telling one person, you know, you won't find anything in your price range in that area. We saw this, but telling the other buyer, oh yeah, a little fix it up, a little paint, and you'll be fine. It could be asking one customer for ID, but not asking the other customer for ID or to sign a contract. It could be making unsolicited comments like the ones we've seen about race or religion or about crime or schools. We'll talk more about schools. It could be a way of talking about resale value. You wouldn't want to be there, poor resale value, to one buyer, but not sharing that same information with another buyer. We saw examples of that. Yes. It could be giving listings to one buyer in an area, but giving listings to a similarly qualified buyer in different areas or substantially different areas. And that was the most common type of steering that we saw. Overall, our white buyers got more listings, an average of 50% more listings. Wow. It was more equal for Asian or Hispanic buyers with their white counterparts, but a huge difference in the number of listings that agents gave white and African American buyers. So also steering happens not only in what information is provided, but in what information is not provided. We consistently saw differences in the two buyers coming back from the same agent just in what they had in their hands. One would get a school brochure and the other would not. It was they would bring back and we put in the file, and the files were of different width, what was going in the file. We were focusing on the differences in school districts and communities, but what we didn't expect was the barriers to entry and then the improper comments. That sort of came along. Mm-hmm. And overall, we had, let me mention another aspect of this. So you've gotten the idea that we had mostly white communities, very white communities, where almost all the listings that were sent to anyone were sent to the white buyer in those communities. Mm-hmm. We had, so in effect, minorities shut out of those communities. Yeah. We also had minority communities where no one got listings. So we had agents steering buyers of all colors around the minority areas. So these were the communities with the most heavily concentrated black population on Long Island. Like the rest of the country, Long Island's very diverse and increasing in its diversity overall, but African Americans are consistently packed into only a very small number of communities. And we saw that in the listings. They were given those communities that were sort of somewhat minority integrated, but the agents were steering around the heavily black areas for all buyers. And then we had integrated listings, where agents might have gotten the idea that's an Asian community or that's a Hispanic community, and they would steer more there. Mm-hmm. One thing that our experts had to say was that not only would the buyer or the tester have a legal case under the Fair Housing Act, but these communities would have a legal case against the agents and against their brokerages under the Fair Housing Act, because these communities, white, integrated, minority, all of these communities are being harmed. They're being robbed of being able to have a desegregated community. Sellers in those areas are being robbed of having all buyers sent to them. And the governments, the home sellers, in the agents with listings in those communities would have a case under the Fair Housing Act. Now, we're not saying, I want to point out, that real estate agents created segregation. Mm-hmm. You may have, I think, a conversation coming up with Richard Rothstein in his book, The Color of Law, which is about the government roots back in the Depression era of segregated housing in America. Mm-hmm. New suburbs where only whites were allowed to buy, or where only whites could get financing under federal guidelines. And Richard focuses very much on the government action as the cause of this. I don't think he thinks that the realtors are at fault. I think he thinks the government created this. But nevertheless, it's clear that what we found shows that real estate agents were perpetuating, were continuing that segregation. Yes. We have a video clip with a strong example of steering. Mm-hmm. Yes. One man and his family were warned away from living in an area because of crime, when the same agents did not warn the other buyer and his family about living in that area.
Okay, let's take a look at that clip. And while I get it ready, just so everyone knows, as Bill mentioned, Richard Rothstein will be joining us 2 weeks from today. So be sure to mark your calendars for that. Let's take a look at this clip.
Kelvin Toon is a black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're the nicest people. When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going to visit.
Do you want to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white testers, saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the black tester. The listings centered black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood and was directed towards much whiter neighborhoods.
So, Bill, I want to answer a few questions from our members that I've seen popping up. And don't worry, I have seen all of your questions, some of which I'm already planning to ask him a little later in the program. So don't think I'm ignoring your questions this morning. We just have a lot to go over. Delora asked, were new home sales tested?
We didn't go to developers, but we went through realtors to help our home buyers, and there were some new homes in new developments, or Long Island's mostly built up, but it's not Houston area, but it's mostly built up. But there were some small new developments that those homes were included in listings that one person or another would get.
Okay, very good. We had a question that came through. What is the appropriate answer when a client asks their agent, "Is this a good neighborhood?" So could you say this is higher in crime?
It's a fair question.
If you give that answer to everyone?
We're going to talk about schools, that context in schools in a minute, and you'll see an expert discuss that. But in short, the shorthand answer is if you give factual information and you give it the same to everyone, you're okay.
Okay, very good. Easy enough answer. So do you think that the agents that were included in this documentary were knowingly steering? Or do you think that it was some of its unconscious bias?
It's in a way more comforting and more challenging if it's unconscious, isn't it? I think the first point is that it doesn't matter. The Fair Housing Act and your local state laws don't regulate your thoughts. The law is not a mind reader. What's regulated is your behavior. So we don't know your motives, and as journalists we certainly don't, but we don't know your motives, and your motives don't matter. If you're treating one person better than another person who's similarly situated, and the difference between them is one of the 7 categories of the Fair Housing Act, you violated the law. Those categories are color, race, religion, national origin, disability, sex, and family status, like having children or not, being pregnant or not. You also have state and local laws that may include marital status and sexual orientation, but those 2 are not in the Fair Housing Act. Some agents may have had reasons to steer, to get to your question. Some may have wanted to keep their home areas of the same race that they are now. Maybe. We didn't. We had a hint of that. We noticed that agents were far more likely to tell white buyers the name of the community that the agent lived in and to recommend that community than they were to tell minority buyers where the agent lived. One agent kept offering to find babysitting for our white tester, but didn't even tell the minority tester what community the agent lived in. Some agents might have a strong anti-minority bias. I assumed that that's a tiny group. I think it's more charitable to assume that's not the main problem, but we wouldn't know. Some agents may be profiling. Now, we send out people dressed the same and answering questions the same, but some may be assuming that a person of color wouldn't be able to qualify for the mortgage, or might be overstating their price range, and therefore will be wasting the time of the agent driving them around to show them homes, when that agent might be accepting exactly the same story from the white buyer. Some agents might think that people will just buy more quickly if they're shown homes where they'll feel more comfortable, and they're making guesses. Now, they don't know who wants a home in an integrated community and who doesn't, but they might be assuming that there's some bias among the buyers, and so they're playing to that. Similarly, they could be playing to bias of others. They might assume that some buyers, some homeowners would be angry if the agent brought in a person of color to a mostly white community, and then they wouldn't get listings in that community. Some may be dealing with sellers. I mean, how many of you have ever had a seller say to you, don't bring people of color in to look at our home or our neighborhood? I don't want to treat my neighbors that way, that kind of comment. We heard from agents about sellers with that kind of demand. You can turn down the listing. Some of them may actually, you know how when one tooth hurts, it causes another tooth to hurt, sort of referred pain? Well, we may have referred racism in some cases where an agent might assume that lenders would be biased and wouldn't approve the loan, or that appraisers might be biased. There's history of both of those, and the loan wouldn't close. And they could be acting on any of these motives. But remember, none of that matters. None of that matters. In general, on the issue of race, it's easy to apply all of our focus, all the heat on the question, is this person saying that we're being racist? When that's not the right question. The right question is what we're doing treating people equally? That's the right question. It's what you do, not what you say, that you think that matters. I also want to point out also that it's important to point out that these testers, they're just testers, but they're real people, and they were completely unaware of being treated differently. In all but just a couple of cases, they would come back and say, she was so nice, the agent was so nice to me. And then later, when it was all together, they would only see the differences when we would bring the white and minority buyer together in the studio and have them sit together and watch parts of the video and look at the maps of the listings. We can see a case of that here in the video.
Okay, very good. So we'll go ahead and show that now. Before we do, I just want to answer one quick question. Maria asked, were minority agents tested, and did they steer as well? And we
yes, definitely.
Yeah, we saw a few in that video.
Different treatment by race can be done by anyone. There's somehow this idea in the mind of the public that racism is something that only people of one color might do to another. Can an African-American police officer brutalize an African-American person? Yes. We had examples, and you saw some in the comments earlier, where agents of color would say, oh, you don't want to live here. It's like the United Nations. You don't want this kind of area. We didn't focus on the skin color of the agents, but it was clear that the agents were generally a white group, but a diverse group, people from many different backgrounds and races, and that knowing the agent's race didn't help you predict at all how the agent was going to treat the customer.
Very good. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this clip of somebody reacting to the video of them being steered.
It almost makes me wish that the racism is more explicit so that I would know about it.
Too often I hear people who maybe aren't as familiar with this kind of work say, oh, well, they were just testers. But all you have to do is tell someone, which I have to do on a fairly regular basis, that you were turned down because of your race, and tell them the circumstances that occurred on a particular test. And you will see just how real and painful that injury is.
Elmont, it's okay, it's good, you're very close to the city. Some of them are not as nice, Elmont.
I do remember him. He was nice, and I do remember him pointing out on the map.
Oh, he loved that map. I remember that.
Yeah, he had the map, and he's like,
Some of these towns, in my opinion, are not necessarily the greatest in terms of school districts, safety, crime, resale.
All right.
One of the things that startled us time after time was that agents would begin their presentation to a new customer. You know, hi, I'm looking for a home, come on in. You know, you're taking call, the person's taking walk-ins, or we've called and been assigned. It's your first meeting. And time after time, there were agents who began their presentation with material that's inappropriate under the Fair Housing Act, showing the map, avoid these areas. And therefore, after a while, we realized this doesn't seem to be offhand comments or spontaneous slurs or something. This seemed to be the sales pitch. This seemed to be part of their function, to narrow the choice of neighborhoods for each buyer and to help them in that, but to help different people differently. I guess we have to say it seemed to us after a while that the agents viewed, some agents, the steering agents, viewed steering as part of their service to the client. And that was surprising to us. Again, I suspect that there has not been sufficient discussion of steering in real estate agencies, but has been more sort of thought about fair housing as what not to say about, you know, minority groups or religion, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that was pretty obvious that going back to the inappropriate comments, they were only made to the white testers. So they know who not to say things to and who to say what to, right? So going back to schools, we mentioned schools earlier. So what role did schools play in the actions of some of these agents?
Schools are so key. We had buyers told by agents repeatedly on Long Island, they would say everything is by schools on Long Island. And they would use a little screening software in the MLS to choose listings. And, you know, one of the steps was to tick off communities or school districts to where you would get the listings. And it was common for agents to tout one school district over others. That's a declining area, or these are really good schools, but then to give different information to different buyers. Some agents, going back to the question earlier, have the idea, oh, we can't mention schools, we can't talk about schools. The Fair Housing Act doesn't say you can't talk about schools. It says that you can give straightforward information. The case law says clearly that you can give straightforward information. You can say, go to this website. It has test scores and other information about the schools. You understand that test scores mostly reflect not the quality of teaching in a school, but which students with which home backgrounds go to those schools. Test scores and demographics are very closely tied. You tell me who's admitted in the 7th grade, we can mostly tell you what their SAT scores are. It's mostly not the schools producing the test scores. But that's a common misunderstanding in the public mind. If you want to share test scores to all your clients, you can do that. You should, the experts say, stay away from sharing demographic information, racial breakdowns and the like with your clients. Here's a discussion about that from one of our experts, the law professor who wrote the textbook on fair housing.
Okay, let's take a look at it.
I said, do you really want your future children going to Amityville School District?
We're going to try and stay away from Freeport, Roosevelt, Hempstead for now because of the school district.
This part, the Salisbury part, is in demand because the schools are much, much, much better.
In Newsday's 86 paired tests, agents often applied a laser-like focus on school districts, highlighting their perceived quality when recommending places that house hunters should consider buying or avoid. Fair housing experts say touting or disparaging school districts can put agents in jeopardy because talking about school districts can be taken as a euphemism for race.
There's a few districts that I know I would I won't look in those towns.
Oh, okay.
You know, like Freeport and Baldwin and Amityville, which is part of Massapequa schools, but it's just certain parts of Massapequa.
If the customer asked about the quality of the schools and the agent responded with accurate information, I think the agent would be fine. The problem with talking about differentials in schools is that at least in the last 10 or 15 years, that has been a proxy for race. They don't mention the race of the community. Good schools are available in these areas. Those areas I'd stay away from because they have poor schools. I want to ask, did you tell that to the other tester? If you're only giving that information to one tester of the two, and the only difference is their race, then you've provided what I call differential service.
You only, if you're in Massapequa, you only want school district 23. Okay. You don't want 6 in Massapequa because that takes in Amityville, and you're not going to like those schools.
I hope that helps clarify. You know, it's I think the sort of follow-up thought on that is to ask yourself, when did I, as an agent, become an expert on schools? That's not what the training is. Do you really know who wants a math program and who wants a music program and which school will be right for every student? So you might just sort of back off a little bit on the idea that part of your function is to be the school experts and help people choose the right school. If you want to tell everybody what the best schools are in your opinion, or give them some objective information about that, go right ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Lionel said it seems like the agents are choosing school districts for the client versus the client deciding what school district they want to be in.
We saw a lot. Our testers would come back with little handwritten lists and of schools from the agents would write out lists. They just weren't writing out the same list for each customer.
Yeah, definitely. Just a comment here from Shad. I think the key is to give the same information to everyone and let them make the decision. And that's a great point. And I do want to mention we have a ton of school information on har.com. So those of you that are looking for that school information, you have it right there on har.com already. So I have another question for you, and I saw somebody else ask this in the comments. What was the reaction from the real estate industry and specifically the agents on Long Island, or even the companies that some of these agents were working with?
Well, so first, it seems that we've raised awareness. The general answer from the companies was, well, this behavior goes against our long-standing practice of treating everybody equally, and we respond to all complaints. Mm-hmm. But as we've all seen, the people wouldn't know if they're treated differently, so therefore there would not be any complaints.
Right. There's not a sign on the door, like you said earlier.
Yes, I think partly what comes next in terms of reaction is you're likely to see more training, maybe better training, more testing by government and media and fair housing groups, mm-hmm. and self-testing by large real estate companies, that is, testing their own agents. And you may see more enforcement. You know, if you want to stop speeding, put some money in radar. New York's governor and attorney general have both announced investigations. We'll see what happens from that. The agents involved in the tests that were negative were subpoenaed to appear before a state Senate committee. The head of Realogy, the large company that owns many of these brands, came and gave a very forthright answer about how he was going to start doing self-testing in his companies. Mm-hmm. But the agents didn't show up. And the agents have been subpoenaed now to come to a hearing post-pandemic. The New York Association of Realtors suspended its training program, which we found so thin, and they're rewriting their curriculum. Mm. I don't know if the agents in our videos will lose their licenses. If you're a fair housing group, there were a complaint or a reason to test a particular agent, if you were going to sue that agent, you would test that agent multiple times, multiple pairs, mm-hmm. to build a case. We didn't do that. We tested each agent just one pair. Now, we tested their offices. If we tested you, we tested others in your offices. So we tested multiple times in an office, and we tested many times at these 12 companies. But I don't know if there will be enforcement against particular companies. Mm-hmm. I do think that there's going to be more self-testing. The National Association of Realtors has a new fair housing initiative. They hired a person from HUD before our stories came out, but they've announced new programs looking at state licensing and training of realtors, improving fair housing training, a new initiative in training, but also developing a protocol for self-testing. So get that. That's the National Association of Realtors developing a cookbook for companies to follow to test their own agents.
That'd be wonderful.
An effort by the industry, perhaps, at self-regulation. Now, testing is expensive, but you have to, so there's always a limit on how much testing will happen. But you have to think about this as a reputational risk. If you or your coworkers or your employees in your brokerage were tested tomorrow and those videos went up on YouTube, how would you do is a question you have to ask yourself.
Yeah. And just kind of taking a look at the comments, a lot of our members saying what they do and the practices they put in place. I think it's important to note that 60% of the agents that were tested did treat clients fairly, right?
And we
So
listed
the
their
good
names.
news.
We
Right.
listed a group of passing agents and agencies. There were 2 of the 12 companies that had no agent that we ruled their test out of. Our experts found them out of bounds. But 10 of the 12 had at least one agent who was.
Yeah, so the good news is 60% were doing
That's
it correctly, but the bad news is that only 60% were doing it correctly. So
yeah, I know people like good news headlines, but if 60% of the planes that come into Bush Airport land safely, that's not a good record.
Right, and that would also be a headline. For sure. So let's get into, and again, several of our members were asking this in the comments too, just how do you think, what are some of the best ways that we can combat racism in real estate?
This is an excellent question. Several sort of fixes are suggested here. One is that combating racism isn't really the trick. It's combating unequal treatment. Often during our project, as journalists, we were like air traffic controllers. We're sending these testers out and they're coming back and reviewing the videos. And I often thought, if I were running a real estate brokerage and I wanted to stop steering from happening, what would I do? Is it really that hard to stop this practice? It seems clear that offices don't have, that we encountered, but need rigorous standards for what we do and don't do with every client. If we give some clients this brochure, give that brochure to all clients. If we have requirements of clients, whether it's ID or pre-approval or other requirements, then ask them of everyone. If we ask one person their credit score, ask everyone. If you're going to ask anyone their income, ask everyone. We got the impression that most offices, and I understand real estate is widely dispersed with many full and part-time agents in an office. It's very difficult to have standards of how everyone is treated, but that seemed to be key. I'd like to give the law professor Bob Schwinn from Kentucky a word on this. In a short clip where he gives you a strong challenge on this question.
Okay, let's take a look.
I'm a law professor at the University of Kentucky, and I've been a law professor for a long number of years. All we're asking in these tests, you get 2 people who come in and ask for exactly the same thing. Why don't you give them the same listing? Why don't you pre-qualify them in exactly the same way? It's not that big a burden. This is a law. This should be treated like a tax law or any other law. You have to obey this law, and particularly if you're in a licensed business like real estate agents, if you can't obey the law, you ought to just get out.
Last clip.
Yeah, so that was the last clip we have to show, but in just a minute we'll give you guys the link to the full documentary. I think it's important for everyone to take a look at. These are just some of the snippets. One thing that really stood out to me towards the end was just the reaction from some of the testers. you know, you said in the beginning, most of them were actors, but they're all still people. So seeing, you know, how
Yes.
they were treated versus somebody of a different
Yes.
race or ethnicity was really
Yes.
compelling.
I think if you're trying to fix this problem in your office, or to prevent this from happening when you bring on a new agent, let's say, you could argue that there are several fixes that would help. You could say that, well, we respond to complaints, but as we all know, that most people wouldn't know to complain. You could try to fix this by diversifying your workforce, and there was a question about that. There are all sorts of benefits of diversifying your workforce, but that doesn't ensure you won't be steering, as we saw. You could argue that a fix would be adding offices in more diverse neighborhoods. We certainly saw on Long Island, these 12 companies that dominate the market had 218 branch offices in our 2 counties. And not a single one of them was in the 8 communities where most of the island's racial minorities live. Not a single one of those 218. Their offices were in areas that were on average 75% white. At Century 21, that was the best, ranging up to offices in areas that were 86% white. That was Keller Williams. That was the worst. That was the range. But they were all in very white areas. Maybe being in more diverse areas would give their agents more familiarity with a more diverse area. They might have more listings in those areas. They might then show more home buyers listings in those areas. Yeah. So representing more sellers. We heard over and over again from the real estate agents who represent sellers in minority areas who said, oh, we're with little mom and pop shops. The big companies don't send buyers. An agent would say, oh, yes, I've been selling homes here for a generation. My parents sold homes here. And the big companies we could name, they've never sent us a single buyer to look at one of our listings in my lifetime.
Wow.
You could argue that the fix is better training. Already, New York requires training, 22 hours of continuing ed every 2 years. And 4 of those hours have to be about fair housing. But we attended classes where 15 minutes of the class would really be about fair housing. The curriculum was very poor. There were a lot of jokes and stories, not much focus. If I think about the fix for this, let me offer an outsider's, I'm not a real estate person, let me offer an impression that I gained watching these tests one after another. Just see what you think of this. When I reported about traffic tickets and who gets a warning and who gets a break, who gets a ticket, who gets a warning. If you wanted to stop unequal treatment in that, we could have a task force if we wanted, but we would all know how to fix that problem in 5 minutes. Give everybody a ticket. If you're speeding, you get a ticket. We could even have the cars give you the ticket. Your insurance companies are doing that now, surcharging you for aggressive driving. And the racial profiling goes away. If you want to stop steering, stop steering. It surprised me that agents were picking communities and schools at all, but they clearly seem to view that as their function. Some would choose the same neighborhoods and schools for our clueless first-time home buyers, but then about 40% chose different communities and schools. And I just couldn't quite understand why they were doing that at all. Why does the agent need to say, you seem like a person who would like these areas and not those areas? In other words, if a person comes in and says, I want up to $500,000 and 2 bedrooms within 40 minutes of the hospital where my wife works or the nursing home where my mother is, why not send them all those listings? Why not give them the keys to your system, send them a link, do whatever you do to share listings with them, and give them all the listings that fit their criteria? Why would some buyers ever get a lot and some get few? Why would some get one neighborhood and not another? It was puzzling to me. And I guess the question you have to ask yourself, is that really what we're selling? Are we afraid that if we stop doing that, we wouldn't really have a service? Now, and I know that real estate agents do a lot more for clients than choosing neighborhoods and assisting them in finding the right home. But I think if you want to take the bias or the unconscious bias out of it, then you have a rule that you treat everybody the same. Everybody gets the ticket. Everybody gets all the listings.
Yeah.
And that would stop the problem by next Tuesday.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. And again, we'll share the link to the entire documentary that you can watch. It's about 40 minutes long, but such a compelling 40 minutes. It goes quickly. And also in the comments, we shared a link to a training that we have actually going on tomorrow at Home with Diversity. So be sure to check that out as well. Bill, this has been excellent. So much information. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Is there anything else you want to share?
Thank you. I hope you'll watch our documentary. It's 40 minutes, and I hope you'll read the series. And if you have stories of your own, please reach out to me. Email. You'll see bill@powerreporting.com.
bill@powerreporting.com. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you.
So that is it for this Member Focus Monday. We will be back next Monday at 9 a.m. And don't forget the following Monday, the 27th, we will have Richard Rothstein, as we mentioned earlier in this program, the author of the book, The Color of Law. I saw in the comments some of you have already been reading it and ordered that book recently. So if you'd like to hear from him, he'll be here in 2 weeks. But we will be here again next Monday at 9 a.m. I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Bye-bye.